Bertie talks to the leader in association with the Guardian Voluntary Sector Network and becausei'sgood.org.
Hello, I'm Bertie Boredon. I've been working in a not-for-profit sector for over 10 years. In this podcast, I talk to chief executives, managers and innovators of the UK voluntary sector. I ask them about their role, motivations and challenges. Welcome to Talk to the Leader. My guest worked for nearly 20 years as a communications professional, mainly on international development. She was head of communications at Oxfam and also chair at ActionAid UK. In 2004, she joined EveryChild and is chair of the board of Bond, the UK's broadest network for voluntary organisations working in international development. My guest is Anna Feuchtwang, chief executive of EveryChild. Hello, Anna.
Hi.
So could you tell me a bit more about the work of EveryChild?
Yeah, EveryChild's an international development organisation, and we work with children who, for one reason or another, have lost family care. So they're outside of families. They may be living on the streets or in institutional care or working for employers in very difficult circumstances. And what we do is we help them get back into family care, and we help to protect families and preserve families so that children don't lose parental care.
So do you operate in the UK or do you operate globally?
We only operate globally, but we network with organisations in the UK who do a similar job in the UK. We don't have any programming here.
So do you remember the very first time you did something for a charity?
Well, I guess it depends how you define a charity. The very first time I did anything as a volunteer was for the anti-apartheid movement. So that was back in the 80s as a school student, and I was really involved in fighting against apartheid and volunteering for the local anti-apartheid team. And I also got really heavily involved in Central American solidarity projects like Nicaragua Solidarity and Chile Solidarity and that kind of issue. So I guess I was always very motivated by issues around justice and wanting to make the world a fairer place.
So that's probably why you joined the charity sector in the first place.
It is indeed why I enjoy the charity sector, yeah.
And you've always worked in the sector? Did you work in the commercial?
No, I
before?
started off my first job as a journalist. I trained as a journalist, and I was really lucky. In those days you could get apprenticeships on local newspapers. So I spent 5 years being trained up as a journalist on local newspapers in London. And so I saw the world that I wanted to change as a journalist, thinking I could be a campaigning journalist and change the world that way. And actually, I think I might have gone on to do that had it not been for I was spending all of my time working on international projects like anti-apartheid and solidarity movements. And then a job came up as a press officer at Oxfam. And that seemed to marry the two things I felt most interested in.
And what attracted you to the role of chief executive at EveryChild?
Well, I guess I wanted to find an organisation that, again, met a number of the things that I was interested in. And I felt I had some experience in. And I'd been working for local government on issues, particularly around child protection. This was post the Victoria Colombier case, when the England really changed its legislation around child protection. And I'd been working very closely on that. I'd come out of international development and was working directly with local authorities. And then the job at EveryChild, which was also around child protection and also about kids in the most appalling situation, gave me the opportunity to put back something I'd learnt in local government into a charity.
And do you remember your very first day as chief executive?
Yeah, I think I probably do remember my very first day. It was my first job as a chief executive. And I have to say, and I talked to other new chief executives too, and I think they'd admit this as well, as I kept thinking somebody was going to find me out, because I felt fraudulent. I think it's quite a sort of a humbling experience taking on an organisation for the first time. And you think, well, I've got really great staff here. How am I going to do something that's going to add to what they're already doing? So I remember feeling quite nervous and about whether or not I really had the right skills and experience.
So what have been the biggest changes you witnessed since 2004?
I guess within the organisation itself, we've gone through a huge amount of change organisationally, the way we work and how we operate. So when I first started, EveryChild was delivering programming in a really wide range of areas. So we were working on things like education and health and how to help people improve their economic circumstances. And I think we all realised we were trying to do too much with too little. So we then narrowed the focus to what we thought we were really good at, which was working on child protection and finding ways to really keep children safe, whatever the circumstances they found themselves in. So that involved a very, very big programming shift. But obviously the other thing that's really changed in that time is how technology's changed. In fact, I'd say my whole career has spanned a digital IT revolution. So when I first started on newspapers, it was still on manual typewriters. And I witnessed and lived through the whole technology transformation of newspapers themselves, and then actually of NGOs as well, of charities too. So I guess, but even 7 years ago when I first started at EveryChild, our ability to communicate with our partners and staff overseas was much more limited than it is today. I have to say, it's still not ideal, but it's a lot better than it was.
Could you give me some examples of how you're using technology currently, either to develop or deliver your services or to campaign?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got quite a good social media presence. So we use Twitter and Facebook and all the other social media platforms to promote the work that we do and to link up with other people. And we use our website relatively well, but we think we've got a long way to go on that. And I think that means that there's a lot of potential for it that we're not quite getting the most of yet. I think probably the single most important technological device we use in terms of communicating overseas and for our work is Skype. I mean, that has really changed hugely our ability to, at a very low cost, to talk to people on a more regular basis. I still feel, however, that we're missing a trick, that there's something we haven't quite got right yet. And by the we, I think that's probably wider within the international development world, which is that I've tried so many different platforms and systems, but we still can't get the kind of teleconferencing that I know that the private sector can pay a lot of money for and get, but we still haven't found a cheap way of doing that that's affordable. And I think that there must be a sort of a technological trick that we could be doing better.
So you've got your professional Twitter account. Obviously, there's the organisation one. You've got your professional one. How are you using it to communicate with supporters?
Right. Well, the EveryChild Twitter account we use very much to promote the organisation itself, and particularly for telling people about appeals that we're working on or programming that we're involved in or any other sort of big communications issues, and also to keep in touch with the rest of the sector, because I think it's quite a nice way to talk to each other too. For myself, I tweet, and I actually tweet professionally rather than personally, so I tend not to talk about what I have for breakfast and all the other things that people imagine Twitter is about, which it isn't at all about. So I tend to tweet about the things that I'm professionally interested in. And what I really like about other people's tweets, which I try and emulate myself, is when they put me in touch with information, with other people's websites, with other people's blogs, with reports and papers that I might not otherwise come across. So I tend to follow child protection and child rights specialists and journalists and other INGOs. And that way it gives me a fantastic news feed. I really feel I can keep on top of emerging issues. And I hope that I'm similarly contributing to that by tweeting around issues that I've got some specialism in, where I can direct people to stuff. And I think that's what Twitter is brilliant at, is a kind of snapshot around what's around at the moment, that you can just have a very quick way of briefing yourself.
And there aren't that many chief executives who are using Twitter at the moment, and I think the way you're using it is perfect. What advice would you give to a chief exec who says, "Oh, it's not for me, I don't have the time, there's nothing interesting in my job"?
I'd say give it a go, because it takes seconds to tweet, and the more you do it, the more you get used to it. But it's only when you start using it that you realise how valuable it is for you, and how I use it as a news feed, really. And so if it's lunchtime and I'm having a sandwich and I look at my Twitter account, then it gives me about 3 or 4 different links to things that I might not have known about otherwise, and some fun as well. And so I don't have to keep looking at lots of different websites. I can just go straight to the ones that people are tweeting around. Similarly, that at lunchtime I can cover a couple of things off about things that EveryChild are doing. And that way it's incredibly quick. So I think the most people that are worried or not sure about whether it's for them are probably people who've never looked at Twitter.
Many of the guests I had on this podcast told me about the impact of the recession. Have you been impacted by the recession?
Yes, we have. And I think the impact of the recession came to us quite early on. And it was really to do with the foreign exchange rate. And we ended up having to really cut back and close some programmes down because the value of the pound fell so sharply and we couldn't afford to spend as much. Or rather, what we could spend didn't buy as much. So that was the first big shock. At the moment, we feel we're relatively well cushioned, and I think it's because the people that we get most of our money from are individual givers who've been supporting EveryChild for a long, long time, mainly, firstly, as child sponsors, and they're very loyal, and I think that we would probably be one of the last things they'd cut back on, even if their own incomes had dropped. So we're quite cushioned by that. Our big worry is about our ability to recruit new supporters, and I think we're all finding that it's costing more and more and more to recruit an individual supporter. But at the moment we're not finding it too difficult, but it's in terms of recruitment, but it's costing more. And that will have a knock-on effect in the long term as well.
So at the same time, there are many discussions around the big society. Do you think there will be some opportunities for EveryChild?
I guess it feels like the big society discussion is quite parochial. It's really about the UK big society. I don't think that there's ever been a problem attracting volunteers to the international development charity sector, and I suspect it's the same in the domestic sector. I don't think it's a lack of volunteering that we suffer from. I think the problem in my part of the sector, in international development, is that with the recession hitting and with public services being cut in the UK, people are quite rightly and understandably anxious about what's going on at home. And that might make them feel less able to support what's going on for very poor communities somewhere else. And I think that's going to make it harder for us. But my own experience and my own observation is that the big society has always existed despite government, not because of government. And I'm not sure that unless there's real resource put into supporting the development of charitable opportunities, that actually government's going to do very much with it just by saying it.
And what is the size of EveryChild?
Our income is around 9 million a year, and we employ about 45 people in the UK, and then we work in 15 countries around the world, mainly through partner organisations, not by delivering programmes ourselves.
Do you have a process in place for innovation?
Do we have an innovation process in place? No, I think is the honest answer.
Okay. How do you keep innovating?
Well, we're a fairly young organisation, and I think that helps a lot. But we are also very conscious of needing to respond to an ever-changing external environment. In fact, I think my staff would probably say that sometimes I need to do a little bit less innovation and a little bit more just sticking with things as they are. So since I started 7 years ago, we've been through at least 2 cycles of major change, and the new one that we're involved with at the moment is very innovative and is quite pioneering in sectorial terms. What we're doing is we're establishing a global alliance, a global network of national NGOs working around the world, all trying to help children get back into families. So these national NGOs are from Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, Egypt. There's about 15 of us right now. But they're not INGOs, they're not international NGOs run from the UK. They're run in country by people from that country. And we're setting this up as a global alliance so that we can have the scale and impact that some of the very large international development organisations have, like Oxfam or Save the Children, but where the ownership of that network is by the national members themselves, not by a sort of central headquarters based in the UK or the US or anywhere like that. And this is something that lots of organisations have tried to do and have gone so far down the line, but it really involves giving up quite a lot of power here and transferring it to grassroots organisations. So that's the biggest innovation I've been involved in. It's also the most exciting and the one that I'm most proud of, because I really feel that if we can put the resources and the decision making in the hands of those that are closest to the children that we're trying to support, we'll have much, much, much better results.
It sounds a bit like a sort of social media model where you're empowering.
Exactly like that, spot on. And it's very much actually inspired by work I've seen on social media networking and I think and network journalism as well. So the whole idea of citizen journalism and people contributing and making the news stories themselves is, I find, really inspirational. It is inspired too by the time I've spent working with Bond as a volunteer, not as a paid member of staff, but as a trustee. And I think there is so much more power and collaboration and networking than in organisations trying to work in isolation. And it sounds like an obvious thing to say, but I think there aren't that many examples of real collaboration. Bond is one of them, and I think that if you can bring together the diverse range of international NGOs in the UK, over 370 members, and have some coherence, some cohesion around that, then we can do that globally for a very specialist subject that EveryChild is concerned about, which is child protection and children without family care. So having chaired Bond for the last 3 years and been on the board for 6, I thought, well, actually, if we can do that with Bond, I don't see why we shouldn't be able to do that as EveryChild. So at the moment, the things that are really frustrating is technological obstacles. There's 15 of us. We can't afford to meet more than twice a year at the very most because it's so expensive. But we need to talk much more often than that. And we still haven't found a really good platform for it. I mean, we can do it through sort of email and all the rest of it, but not in terms of a real live conversation. And I just think there must be something that somebody could help us with that would enable this to happen. Because the idea of a social network that's supported by technology is really what's behind the whole concept around the alliance.
If I found anything,
if
anyone listening has any idea about that, they can email.
Especially if there are any really large private sector firms that want to invest in a really brilliant model, because I think the problem is that if you're a national organisation working in, take Egypt, for example, or any of the countries that we've got members in, you just not got the resource to invest in access to broadband. So your telecommunications is likely to be weak and the infrastructure is fragile. And so, mobile phone technology is probably the most reliable, but we haven't found a way quite to trigger that to help us with global discussions.
Any big opportunities you regret to have missed or were too late to grab?
I think it's probably along the same lines, actually, which is I think that one of the things that the sort of technological revolution has offered us is the opportunity to bring people's voices who don't normally get an opportunity to be heard into the global media, into our organisations. And I remember going on a visit to a programme in Malawi about 6 years ago, and thinking, God, I met some fantastic people, and they talk to each other every day, and they use English quite a lot. I wish there was a way that we could, really easily record this and get it back home instantly. And then, of course, there were things I could have been doing then, but I just didn't know about them. And I think that would have been great, actually. And I still don't think we're using enough of that. I think there's a sort of, in my experience, NGOs, charities tend to be a few years behind everybody else, partly because we are so careful about what we put our money into, and we don't want to buy stuff unless it's been tried and tested. So I sort of wish we'd taken a bit of a leap of faith then and invested more in I can't even remember what they're called, but the sort of little video cameras that you can
the
get.
Flip. They don't exist anymore. They stopped making them.
Fantastic.
I think they stopped because now people have mobile phones with cameras, and so we had one at Breast Cancer Care, and we can see that now we move from doing very well produced videos to just asking staff what they're working on.
That's exactly what it is. And people, I think the other bit we missed is exactly that, which was thinking that the audiences all had an expectation about it being glossy and professional looking. Whereas if you look at the trend in social networks and YouTube and everything else, it was real user user produced, and people were very tolerant of rough around the edges, just sort of handheld stuff. And we've seen that through the Arab Spring and all the rest of it. People will take that kind of footage and will understand it. And I think we were far too worried about it looking right, and actually that wasn't the point. The point was it being authentic. And authentic is somebody videoing somebody on the phone that they know and are talking to in a conversation. You can't get more authentic than that. So I wish I'd done more of that.
Well, I'm sure you'll have more opportunities. So what do you see as your main challenges in the next few years?
Well, I think the recession will be a very big challenge. I think, EveryChild's got a very loyal supporter base, but we don't really know what's going to happen to each of them individually. And if people are losing income and finding it hard to make ends meet in their own lives, I think inevitably they'll be might feel less able to support EveryChild and other charities. So I think that's definitely one to watch. I do think that there is a potential problem for the general support that people give international development. That some of the recent public surveys of attitudes to international development show that it's beginning to drop. And that, again, it's the sort of charity begins at home mentality. And I think trying to remember that we do live in a global world. We are all interconnected, and being able to carry on, getting people to carry on supporting injustice issues in other countries is just as important as it is to support the same sort of issues here. I think that's going to be challenging. The other really, really obvious major challenges is that if we think the recession is bad here, then you should see what it's like in other countries. And so we know that levels of poverty in the communities that we're working with are increasing, food prices, oil prices, all going up. That means that far more children are likely to lose parental care, because one of the main reasons kids end up leaving home is either they run away because home's become a much more unpleasant place to be in terms of a link between poverty and violence and all kinds of social dysfunctionality, but also because kids are sent away to find work to bring money into to support the family. So we know that is likely to increase, and I think increasing concerns about climate change and droughts and famine and access to water will also increase conflict, and that is also likely to drive more children away from home and separate them from their families. So that's our biggest challenge, as we know this is a growing problem.
If you were not chief exec of EveryChild, what would you do?
It's a toss-up between staying in journalism, having not left journalism when I did, and wanting to sort of pursue what is a very inherent and basic nosiness about my personality. So actually wanting to have been a print journalist, I think. But if it wasn't that, I think the other thing I really would have been and could have been would be something like a child psychotherapist, working directly with children and not just managing people that work with children.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Bertie.
That was Talk to the Leader with Bertie Boredon. To find out more about this podcast and how to subscribe, go to nfp.org.uk.